Hello and welcome back to the Totally Rad Guitar Studio on this lovely rainy evening. This is going to be one of my most requested videos. When I did the video on the Mesa Mark IV a while ago, I went over the circuit, did some sound demos, played with the switches, and that seemed to be pretty well received. I get a ton of questions asking me whether I prefer the Mark IV or the Mark V. I still have the Mark V, I sold the Mark IV, and the short answer, if you don't want to watch the rest of the video, is I like the Mark IV better. Now, as for why I like the Mark IV better, it's because of my priorities as a player. So I've got a ton of different amps to choose from. I'm not really worried about not being able to find a good sound, and I don't play live, so features on amps like the Mark V that make it a little bit easier to live with than the Mark IV don't really appeal that much to me, because when I have a Mark, I'm after one specific, amazing sounding lead tone, and that's pretty much all I care about. If I wanted to do a clean or a crunch or something like that, I usually pick some other amp in my collection. That's not to say that the Mark V does those things poorly, but the Mark IV definitely is a little bit weaker on Rhythm 1 and Rhythm 2. And, some people like those channels. There's nothing wrong with them. I got some great tones out of them, but they're a little bit, there's a little bit of a compromise there, whereas the lead channel of the Mark IV is really the highlight of the show. On the Mark V, the channels are much more balanced. All these channels are great, but the lead channel is not quite as good as the Mark IV, and that's just an opinion. And part of that really is just because this lead channel is a little bit more, dare I say, dumbed down. I think finally, after so many years of people saying, oh, Mesa Marks are hard to dial in, or they don't sound good with certain speakers, or they don't sound good with certain guitars, or all that stuff, I think the designers at Mesa really, they just wanted to put out an amp that was a little bit easier to understand, a little bit easier to get good tones from, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's more versatile, it's easier to use, it sounds great, it's got better crunch tones. The Mark I mode in particular is really amazing, and it's an exceptional amp. So, if you're only after one specific lead tone, or if you think you might use, and I'll get into this in a little bit more when I go into the circuit, but if you think you want the Mark lead tone and you want a few extra options, like the Mark IV has that, there's the harmonic mode or mid-shift mode, there's the contour switch, there's a drive control and a gain control, and tweaking those controls in different ways can get you a really, really wide range of interesting tones. If you just want that sort of more popular, more common, I guess, sort of cutting Mark rhythm tone, then the 5 will do it just as well as the 4. And that's kind of where your priorities might differ. And if you're performing live, this amp is definitely the better amp. The reverb also sounds incredible. I just figured I'd mention that because I probably won't use it all that much in this. But the Mark IV, I had the reverb set completely off, and if you even had it on a little crack, it affected the rest of the tone of the amplifier, and I really hated that. In fact, some people just disconnect the reverb tanks on their Mark IV altogether, which is probably the right thing to do if you want to get that really perfect lead tone. This amp has a much better, more transparent reverb. It's foot switchable. It wasn't foot switchable on the Mark IV. And this one you also have, so you have, on this foot switch, you have channels 1 through 3. You have a solo boost, which you didn't really have before. You have a mute button. The EQ can be assigned to a channel to be automatically on, or you can trigger it manually from the foot switch. And it's right above the channel 3 button, which is really nice because you can basically stomp on channel 3 or stomp on channel 3 and the EQ at the same time. It's really, really well thought out. And then you have an FX loop switch as well. So, for live performances, this is pretty fantastic. And I'll just kind of explain how it's laid out. So you have 3 channels, but instead of like the Mark III or the Mark IV where you have a really kind of convoluted control scheme, this one's really, really easy. You have these 3 blocks. Each one is 6 knobs. And then there's a couple of other little switches, and I'll cover those in a minute. But you've got channel 1 is this block of 6 knobs. Channel 2 is this block of 6 knobs. Channel 3 is this block of 6 knobs. And then over to the right, you have a graphic EQ, a couple of other controls, and then you have an output, overall output, just like the 4 had, and a solo boost control, which is basically the same function, but you can foot switch it, on and off, and the full power or variac power switch. So I have it in full power mode right now. And then the controls for reverb mix are on the back of the amp, as well as a couple of other controls that I'll get into. So starting off with the first channel, and I'll just kind of explain. So you have these little top switches, and the top switch is what mode that channel is in. So each channel also has 3 different modes. On the clean channel, you have a mode that's just called clean, a mode that's called fat, and a mode that's called tweed, and that just increases the gain and some of the bass a little bit as well. So that one's really easy to understand. On the other channel, channel 2, you have edge, crunch, and Mark 1 mode. Mark 1 with the gain max like I have right now is actually pretty heavy sounding. I don't know if real Mark 1s are quite this heavy, but it wouldn't surprise me. It sounds really great. It's one of my favorite modes. And then the last area, you have the Mark 2C Plus mode, the Mark 4 mode, which is my favorite, of course, and the Extreme mode, which is specific to this Mark 5 amp. And then each control, each section you have gain, master volume, and presence controls, as well as treble, middle, and bass. And then a couple of them have different switches. So the channel 3, since we left off there, has a normal and bright switch. Channel 2 has a mode that only applies to Mark 1, and that is Mark 1 normal or Mark 1 thick. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to be emulating, but when we talk about the circuit, we'll get to that. And then the first channel has a channel 1 normal and channel 1 bold. And basically, when you switch channels, the modes are a bit different in volume from one another, so you can't really switch modes on the fly. Most likely, you'll pick 3 sounds that you really like, and then you'll stick to those. You'll balance the volumes on those, and you'll stick to that setup, and then control the overall volume of the amp with the overall output over here. And then every channel also has this EQ on. There's a middle position for EQ off, and then EQ foot switch. Basically, if you have it in the foot switch position, you can turn on and off the EQ from the foot switch. If you set it to off, it doesn't matter if you foot switch it or anything. You can't turn the EQ on. That's the graphic EQ, I mean. And then EQ on just makes the EQ always on that channel. And then the very last switch on the bottom that each channel has is a 90 watt, 45 watt, or 10 watt switch. And I have all of them in the 45 watt mode. And the reason for that is this amp also has a tube rectifier, which is really, really cool. And as far as I know, that's a first for Mark series amps. The tube rectifier only works in 45 watt mode, and it only works on the clean and crunch channels, the channel 1 and channel 2. There is no tube rectifier mode for channel 3, which I think is kind of a shame. And I read the manual, and it says that the reason is because the Mark 2C, Mark 4, and the Extreme mode, the original amps they're emulating didn't have 2 rectifiers, so they didn't bother giving us the option. And I think that's kind of disappointing because you kind of have, an amp with a lot of options. What if I wanted a tube rectifier on a Mark 4? This would be my chance to have it, but alas, that's not possible. And the tube rectifier can be turned on and off from a little mini switch on the back right next to the reverb control that I mentioned before. So right now I just have everything in 45 watt mode. That way we can use the tube rectifier, and I have the tube rectifier on for both channel 1 and channel 2. Another thing I think is kind of interesting about that statement in the manual about the original amplifiers they're emulating not having tube rectifiers, I do think that's kind of funny because the named amplifiers like the Mark 1 didn't have a tube rectifier either, but you can have it tube rectified on this amp. Just sort of odd choice there, but whatever. And then the graphic EQ section, real quick, the graphic EQ, you have the little switches here for channels 1, 2, and 3. There's sliders and preset, and this is really cool. The sliders mean that if you turn on the EQ for whatever channel, then it's using the graphic EQ sliders that we have here. And if you set it to preset mode, instead you have this little knob over here which can be set differently for channels 1, 2, or 3. And what those do is it basically creates a V-shape EQ, but just using a single control, like a single shape control. The reason why I think that's so cool is I talked about a little bit on the Mark IV video. If you wanted to do a more frowny face graphic EQ setting on, say, channel 2, but then a scooped EQ on channel 3, you couldn't do it. Now you actually can, because if you want to do that scooped EQ, you can pretty closely approximate it just by using the preset knob. So for example, if I wanted to have channel 3 with a really scooped EQ, I actually could set channel 3 to use the preset mode and then set the preset depth from the knob, and then I could set the graphic EQ however I want it and have channel 2 use the graphic EQ instead, or something like that. It's really cool. I'm probably not explaining it all that well, but if you actually sit down with the amp, it makes a ton of sense, and especially if you're going to go out and perform, being able to foot switch between those different settings is really, really good. Okay, so diving into the circuit, and I actually have, slightly embarrassed here, but I actually had to take notes. This circuit is really, really wild because there's just a lot going on. There's 7 preamp tubes, 4 power amp tubes, and a tube rectifier. And the way that they have it laid out, and this is how a lot of modern amps are, is they reuse the same tube stages. So like, if you go back to really, really old... Hi. If you go back to really, really old multi-channel amps, you would have something like, you know, tubes 1 and 2 was for channel 1, and tubes 3 and 4 was for channel 2, or something like that, where they're totally separate from each other. And you can see that like this JCM 800 split channel behind me. If you pull the V2 tube out of that amp, the clean channel stops working, but the boost channel sounds exactly the same, because the clean channel is just 2 gain stages right off of V2. And that's kind of the old style way of doing it. So that amp has 2 channels and 5 tubes in it, which is, you know, a lot. This amp, 7 tubes is still a lot, but you have a ton of gain stages, and just the way that the switching works, it's really genius. I mean, this is a really awesome amp. Now, one thing they did do that to make things a little bit easier is channels 1, 2, and 3. Each channel kind of follows its own path through the circuit, but the modes don't change which tubes are engaged or not. So for example, on the lead channel, if you have, that channel has 6 gain stages, right? Yes. That channel has 6 tube gain stages. And that doesn't matter if you're in Mark II mode, Mark IV mode, or Extreme mode, it's always 6 gain stages. No tubes are being switched in and out. All that's being switched in and out are different component values, like caps and resistors, that alter sort of the, you know, the sonic dynamic of the tone. So that does make it a little bit easier to explain. So we'll start off with channel 1. This is the easy one. You come in, your input signal goes to V1A. That's our input gain stage. Then there's the 3-band EQ tone controls, and then the gain follows that. Then you have the mode switch, and that changes some of the sonic character. And then that leads into V1B. Then it goes to, and the rest of this is common, reverb, which is tubes V4A and V5B. Then another gain stage at V3A. The bold switch is after that, kind of towards the end. Then V3B, which is where the master volume is located. And then after that, graphic EQ effects loop, which has a tube buffer, that's V6B, the presence control, and the phase inverter out to the power amp. So that one's pretty straightforward. Nothing really surprised me there. You've got the tone controls before the gain, just like a Fender or, you know, a classic Mesa Mark modified Fender type design. And you know, that one's pretty self-explanatory. Now, channel 2, you also come into V1A, and then you have a gain control, and then V2A, which is another gain stage, and then the tone controls. So that's a little bit different. You've got your gain control first, and then tube gain stage, and then the tone after that. Then you have the mode switch for the different component values. V1B again is a gain stage, the reverb tube, V3A, the normal and thick mode switch, and then the master volume, graphic EQ, effects loop, presence, phase inverter, power amp, so on. The thing I think is so interesting about that is my favorite mode on this channel is the Mark 1 mode. I really love the Mark 1 mode. You know, it's kind of hard to... I really like the Mark 1 mode. It sounds great. You know, it's really thick and full, and I think it really cops those sort of, you know, 90s, 80s, 90s classic tones really, really well. I like Weezer. Weezer's pretty good, and they use the Mark 1 a lot, and I think that this really nails that Blue Album tone a lot of times. Like if you play Say It Ain't So or My Name Is Jonas or something, that it nails it perfectly. Now, even though it sounds accurate to the recorded tones that I just described, the Mark 1 mode on this is very different from an actual Mark 1 circuit layout. So a real Mark 1, you have the, first of all, you have two inputs. You have input 1 and input 2. If you use input 1, that's like your high gain channel, and you get an extra gain stage on the Mark 1. So that goes volume 1, then V1A, V1B, then your tone controls, then volume 2, which has a bright switch on it, V2A, optional graphic EQ if you have one, then the reverb, V2B, master volume, presence, phase inverter. So it's just a slightly different layout in that the original Mark 1s would have two controls, volume 1 and volume 2, before the master volume. In this one, you only have one gain control. So imagine if you had a Mark 1, and this is, it gets even worse when we get to the channel 3, but if you had a Mark 1 and it was, you know, your favorite amp, and the tone that you loved out of it was volume 1 at 10 but volume 2 at 4. You can't copy that tone with this amp. It just doesn't give you the same controls to accomplish that. And I also was wondering, the Mark 1 has a bright switch, and this one has Mark 1 normal and Mark 1 thick. I don't really know what that means. I guess the thick is the default setting, and then normal is the mode with the bright switch on, or something like that. I'm not really sure, but the Mark 1 mode on this amp, whether in normal or thick mode, it's very, very dark. So I actually have the treble maxed out on this amp, on that channel, but I'll go through all those modes anyway. And now for sort of the star of the show, the channel 3 lead channel, and I'm going to talk about, well, they all follow the same path, right? So on this amp, it goes V1A, then the tone controls, then V1B, another gain stage, then you have a gain control, V5A, V4B, so two more gain stages, the bright switch, then V3A, another gain stage, and then you have the reverb, driver, and return, V6A, the master volume, graphic EQ, effects loop, presence, phase inverter. So that last part with the master volume, graphic EQ, effects loop, presence, phase inverter, that's the same on all channels. That doesn't get changed. And the thing that I think is so interesting about it is the gain control on this amp is where the drive control was on the Mark IV. So if you were trying to copy the tones exactly, the Mark V, the gain control is what used to be the drive control, and the gain control on the Mark IV does not exist on this amp. On the Mark IV, the gain control is right after the tone, right after treble, middle, and bass. So this amp does not have a gain control there, it just skips that step. So that's what I was saying. If there's a certain tone about the Mark IV that you really love with, you know, two different combinations of the gain and drive controls, and even worse if you like maybe with the presence contour pulled out or something like that on the Mark IV, the Mark V will not duplicate that tone. The only thing the Mark V has is the bright switch, and you have the drive control, which is called gain on the Mark V. And again, I'm not saying that I'm disappointed in it. It sounds amazing. Part of the reason why I kept the Mark V over the Mark IV is that I found I was using the Mark IV with both the gain and the drive set to about 8. That was my favorite tone from it. On this amp, I have it also set to, well, a little less. It's like around maybe where 7 would be. And, you know, it sounds so close to the way that I was using the Mark IV anyway that it doesn't really bother me. But if you're the kind of person that tweaks a lot, or you want a little bit of different flavor to your Mark lead tone, then the Mark IV will probably serve you better. And, you know, that's why people say, do you like the Mark IV better? And the answer is yes, based on my situation that I like to tweak a lot, and I sit here and I record and mess around all day. And the Mark V would be better if I were the type of person that actually went out and performed, and I just wanted that exact famous Mark lead tone. This amp does it perfectly. All right, well, sorry for the sort of long tangent there. Let's see how it sounds. So I'm playing a Kramer Pacer Deluxe, and I have a Seymour Duncan full shred in the bridge, which is a kind of more brighter trebly pickup, which fits really well with the low tuning because I'm in drop B, but then the bright character of this amp, so it really weighs out nicely. I think it sounds good. So I'm going to start off, I'm on the clean channel, and I'm on the actual clean mode. I have the gain turned all the way up, and I'm on the normal on the switch. And my controls, basically the trebles at noon, the mids are tucked out just a little bit, and the bass is up just a little bit, and so is the presence. And then the master volume is just to match the volume across all the channels. So right now, this is what it sounds like. And I'm going to kick on the reverb. So the reverb sounds really great, and you can hardly tell any effect on the tone as you switch it in and out, unlike the Mark IV. Which is a huge improvement. So the reverb is very usable on this amp. I'm going to switch to the fat mode now, and you can hear what that sounds like. And I'm going to switch on the bold switch now. So as you can tell, it's getting a little bit louder and a little bit bassier, but the core tone is really the same, and that's not a surprise, considering all that's changing is a couple little component values, and the circuit's generally the same. Now, if I go to the tweed mode, that is going to let a lot more gain in. I'm going to go back to the normal, but I'll switch on the bold about partway through so you can hear the difference. And with the gain maxed, you can get a nice little crunch going, especially on a bridge humbucker like this one. But I think my favorite's probably fat mode. That seems to have a good compromise, but I do really like the bold switch in. It just adds a little extra punch. Okay, so now going over to channel 2, I'm going to set it to the edge mode. The Mark I normal and thick switch doesn't do anything in edge mode, so that doesn't matter. Kind of hear what that sounds like. I also have the gain maxed out on this channel as well. Alright, and now for Mark 1 mode, which is kind of the highlight for me. Not that those other modes are bad. I think crunch mode is a pretty good approximation of like a Marshall-style crunch tone. But Mark 1, I really think sounds exceptional. And I do like to run the treble maxed out. It's very dark. So right now I'll start the gain around half and then turn it up, and then switch on thick mode and turn the treble up so you can hear what that sounds like. So here it is with the gain on half. So it's definitely a bit on the loose side, but it's very gainy. You can get some pretty awesome tones there. And if I switch the tube rectifier off, it would get a little bit tighter as well. I just like that sort of looser feel for, especially for soloing. And I think that Mark 1 mode, especially boosted, is just an absolutely killer solo tone. And you know, that's not really a surprise either. And let me show, if I turn the treble down, so that I have the controls, you know, roughly in the middle, like you might set up an amp if you just walked into the store and are setting it up. This is how it would sound, which I think is part of the reason why a lot of people have trouble with the Mark 1 mode, that it's too dark. So this is what it sounds like with the controls, you know, roughly. I'll just set them all to noon. And then I'll turn thick mode off, but this is what it sounds like. But if I turn that treble up like you would to a traditional Mark, it gets a lot more aggressive sounding. But yeah, I really like that, the way that one sounds. And you can also use the graphic EQ with any channel. I have a little V shape going on here. And this graphic EQ, just in case you didn't know, for the Mark IV also is the same situation. These graphic EQs that are built into the Mesas are active. So anything above the halfway mark, you're actually increasing the gain of those frequencies. And the way that works is through a little op-amp transistor thing. So it's, I mean, I guess if you're the type of person who's a really intense tube purist, then technically you're sort of breaking that by using the graphic EQ. But my attitude is, you know, if it sounds good, who cares? So I've got a little V going. So I'm cutting some frequencies around 750, but then I'm boosting frequencies 80, 240, 2200, and 6600 hertz. And those boosts do increase the gain just a little bit. And I'll show what the preset does as well when we get to channel 3. But sticking with channel 2 right now, if I kick on the EQ there, you can hear what it sounds like. So there's a pretty big volume boost engaging that graphic EQ. And that's kind of what I talked about before, is I didn't notice that much of a volume bump engaging the EQ on the Mark IV. On the Mark IV, I felt like I could pretty much turn on and off the graphic EQ with roughly the same volume on any channel, but that might have been just the way I had my settings or something like that, or maybe having the gain so high is affecting it. But either way, if you're ever going to take this thing live and use it, to perform, you got to make sure that you have your volume set pretty close before you start playing, because engaging that graphic EQ partway through is a pretty big boost in volume. So next I'm going to go over to channel 3. I'll put it in Mark II C mode, and I have, much like the way that I would run a Mark IV or a Mark III, I have the treble control completely maxed. The mids are up a little bit over halfway, and the bass is exactly at noon, along with the presence. And I have the bright switch on, because in the old amps, that was a pretty big difference. But I'll flip that off to start, and then I'll add it back in as I'm playing. And I have this channel set to automatically engage the graphic EQ, so you'll hear it with the EQ on. But I'll put it on the foot switch for right now, just so you can hear what it sounds like without the graphic EQ. So here we go. Now I'm going to go over to Mark IV mode, but instead of just jumping straight to it, I'm going to stay on 2C mode and then switch to Mark IV. That way you can hear the change in sound. It's really a pretty subtle difference. I really, really like Mark IV mode. It's basically the same core tone as the 2C+, but with more bass. But it's still really, really tight and aggressive sounding, even in a low tuning like this one. So obviously that's my favorite mode, and that's part of the reason why I'm so partial to the real Mark IV, is that my favorite mode on the Mark V is the Mark IV mode, but not without all the options. So, and I said I was going to do the preset thing, so let me do that now before we do the extreme mode, because the extreme mode is really just its own can of worms here. So I'll leave my controls set the same way, and here it is with the graphic EQ, and then I'll switch to the preset and turn that knob and you can hear the difference. Alright, well there you go. The preset mode, basically the further you turn it to the right, the more it does that scoop thing, but it doesn't allow quite as much fine tuning, obviously, since it's just one knob compared to having all the sliders. But I really like having the sliders because I tend to boost the bass frequencies a little bit more than I boost the treble frequencies. That helps it feel a little bit thicker and fuller to me. The preset, as far as I know, it's not active, so it's not boosting any frequencies like the actual graphic sliders do. So it doesn't let you do that sort of, you know, asymmetrical smiley face sort of EQ. It's, you know, a strict sort of thing centered on a point, centered on a frequency range that the designers thought most people would use. And that's fine. It works really well for other channels. I just don't particularly like it on channel 3. So it's usable, but not perfect. And that's also why the JP2C, which basically just has 2 of the Mark IIc modes that this amp has 2 graphic EQs on that amp. And I would love to have a second graphic EQ on this amp for the Mark I mode, separate from the 3rd channel where I usually use Mark IV mode. That would be really awesome, because then you could kind of EQ them differently. Because the Mark I mode, because it's already so thick and full, if I use the graphic EQ the same way I have it set up for Mark IV mode, it's way too bassy. And that's part of what makes it sound so loud. But, you know, that's just compromise. There's only so much they could do with such little panel space. And, you know, again, this amp, it's really designed to sort of dumb it down just a little bit for the more common user, because on this amp, like if I set the treble, mids, and bass at 5 on channel 3, it actually sounds pretty good. I'll kick that on right now. But it's a lot it's a lot flubbier than, you know, the way I had it set up. So I think part of the reason that, you know, amp companies do stuff like this is first impressions are so huge when it comes to amp design. If you walk into like Guitar Center or Sam Ash or something, or your local music store, and you go to play this amp, that might be the first and only experience you ever have with that amp. So if it doesn't wow you right then and there, a lot of times, and we're all guilty of this, even if it's a good amp that we would enjoy later some other time, if we didn't like it the first time we play it, it takes a little while to overcome that, feeling about the amp. So I think they set this amp up so that you could basically plug right into it, play it, and it sounds awesome. And then when you get home and you start tweaking it, then you can, discover all the awesome mark tones that it has. The Mark IV doesn't really baby you in that way. If you plug into a Mark IV and you don't really know what you're doing and you set, all the controls to 5 or something like that, it's probably not going to sound very good. And that's part of why I did that video on the Mark IV to begin with, is I wanted to explain to people, if you come across one, this is how you should set it up to, get that classic mark tone. So, all right, last mode, channel 3, the extreme mode, and there's a huge volume boost when I go to extreme mode. So I'm going to turn that output down a little bit, and I'll trickle it back in to make sure I don't clip the mic. But the extreme mode is a lot midier, way midier, and not quite as tight, but still pretty close. It seems like a logical progression. The Mark IIc, if that's your starting point, Mark IV adds a little bit more bass to that core tone. And then extreme mode adds more mids, and then you've got this like really thick full thing. And I think actually it kind of it sort of competes with like a PV 6505 or 5150 or EVH 5150 or something like that, for that sort of like modern metal metalcore type, really thick mids, heavily saturated type lead tone. So I've got the EQ engaged, but I'll turn it off for right now, just so you can hear what it sounds like without it. So here's extreme mode. Yeah, so I think the extreme mode is a little bit of a letdown. It's not, if you wanted that kind of tone, you'd probably be happier with a 6505 or something like that instead anyway. So real quick also, I'm going to do, kind of set up back the original way that I had it. So I'm going to use Mark IV mode, but I'm going to kick the reverb on so you can hear what the reverb sounds like through the distortion. It actually sounds really good. So here we go. It just adds a little bit of sort of air behind it, and it sounds good for leads. And that reverb switch is right next to the effects loop switch. So it's pretty cool to be able to switch on, if you want to switch on like a delay and a chorus, then you don't need a reverb pedal. You can, use the actual spring reverb in the amp. I do kind of wish the way that they have it set up where the EQ can be pre-engaged when switching to certain channels, I kind of want it to be the same for reverb. Like, I wish I could set the reverb to be automatically on the clean channel and off on the other two channels or something like that. That would be a nice like quality of life improvement. So hey, I mean, maybe someday we'll see a Mesa Mark 6. Fingers crossed. That would be pretty awesome. This amp is, let's see, 14 years old now, which is hard to believe because the Mark V still seems brand new to me. I mean, I remember when this thing came out and everybody was, really wowed by it. And it's hard to believe it's that old of an amp now, but it has been out for a pretty long time. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope this helps someone in their comparison between the various Mark series amps. I have a ton of other amps that I want to do reviews for. If you have any special requests, let me know. And otherwise, just stay tuned, and thanks for watching. Have a good one.